Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Adath Israel Congregation Zoom presentation featuring Corinne Levitt discussing her recent book, Exceptional Minds Across the Autism Spectrum. Before we begin, a little housekeeping. If you can find it, please go to on view webinar, put yourself on speaker view. If not, please put yourself on mute. Otherwise, we will. Okay. I'm Randy Fine. It's my honor to be here to introduce our speakers. My name, I told you, and I am a retired from the social service sector. And in my spare time, when it isn't COVID, I have the honor of working in a wonderful preschool for children with all kinds of special needs, including autism. And I have learned so much, but I have so much more to learn. And so I'm looking forward to this presentation. I'm also a very, active member of that Israel congregation. So it's my delight to see you here, especially knowing these are difficult times out there, and we hope you're all well and safe. So for the next hour, sit back and relax. We're going to have a wonderful presentation. We want to thank the Families with Young Children Committee under the chairmanship of Joe Traeger and Stan Lakin, and the Adath Israel staff for putting on today's program. Corinne Levitt, as we mentioned, is a teacher, educator, and author, is today's featured guest. Her presentation will be very interesting and certainly eye-opening. There will be a chance for questions, so stay tuned. Today's moderator is Hesh Troper. I'm very pleased to introduce Hesh. Hesh is a professor of history of education at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. In addition to teaching courses in the history of education and schooling, Hesh has written a number of award-winning books, including None is Too Many, Canada and the Jews of Europe from 1933 to 1948, The Defining Decade, Identity, Politics, and the Canadian Jewish Community in the 1960s, and The Ransomed of God, the remarkable story of one woman's role in the rescue of Syrian Jews. Interesting all by itself. Please welcome Hesh Troper.
Well, okay. Thank you. Thank you for that warm introduction. Our speaker today is Corinne Levitt, a very, very close friend of many years. Corinne was born and raised in Toronto. She is now a retired teacher, but during her nearly 40 years of teaching, Corinne was deeply involved with special education, notably her work with children and adolescents with autism and other developmental challenges. Encouraged by and with the support of Temple Grandin, Corinne has written, as you've heard, a powerful and groundbreaking book, Exceptional Minds Across the Autism Spectrum. This book deals with her success in teaching to the talent, and it is a book that showcases the voice of Corinne's students and their families. Dr. Darrell Treffert, one among the world's leading authorities on hyperlaxia, savant syndrome, and autism, has written, and I quote, "This is an exceptional book about exceptional minds by an exceptional teacher that advises how to teach to the talent and how to use handicaps and deficits as teaching opportunities. If I were to recommend but one book on strength-based education to an established or beginning teacher in any public or private elementary or secondary classroom with special needs children with a variety of learning and other disabilities, it would be this book. All the net proceeds from the sale of this book will go to various autism charities through a fund established at the Jewish Community Foundation of Montreal." Now, I'm delighted to give you Corinne Levitt.
Thank you, Hesh, for that lovely introduction. And thank you to the Adath Israel for hosting today's event and bringing people together at a time when we need it the most. My book is about community, for it takes a community to bring about real change. And communities are about more than inclusion. They are about belonging, being valued, and recognized. My book was written with that spirit in mind and celebrates the voices of my students and their families, along with highlighting the contributions made by leaders in the field of autism education. So many people joined in support as I wrote this book, so it was far from being a solitary activity. And I would like to take this time to thank Janice Rotman for believing in this book and sponsoring its publication. I am also grateful for the support I received from Temple Grandin. You may have heard of her. Her life was celebrated in an HBO film named after her, and Claire Danes played Temple Grandin. She is a distinguished professor of animal science at Colorado State University and a leading expert in the design of humane animal handling facilities. She is also one of the world's most accomplished adults with autism. Now in her 70s, she continues to advocate for a deeper understanding of autism and different kinds of minds. I was fortunate to meet her in Montreal at an autism conference. She was the keynote speaker. She was excellent. And I was lucky that I got a chance to talk with her. And she immediately wanted to know about my students and the classroom and some of the challenges I faced as a teacher, the struggles the students were having. And we both recognized the ongoing need to promote the importance of developing a child's strengths and abilities. And that's a message which runs throughout my book. I greatly appreciate her support and interest and encouragement as I was writing the book, and was thrilled when she offered to write a blurb that's on the front cover. Before we meet my students, though, I just want to mention that the names and identifying details of my students and their families have been changed to maintain confidentiality. Instead, I present composite student profiles based on experiences with students in various school settings. These profiles maintain similar learning styles while respecting the integrity of individual experiences. These profiles may remind you of individuals you know, or may prepare you for those you have yet to meet. And in the case of students whose identity and work have been published, their names are included. After almost 4 decades of working as a special educator, it is curious that I now find myself advocating on behalf of students with autism or developmental differences in much the same way I did back in the 70s when I first started teaching students with learning disabilities. I landed my first teaching job in the middle of the 1970s, and I was in for a bit of a bumpy ride. Special education was still in its infancy, and attitudes towards exceptional students were slowly beginning to shift as public school boards would soon be legislated to accept all students with special needs. And that was in response to pressure from the civil rights movement. Up until this point, children with disabilities only had discretionary access to schools. Many were in residential facilities, sheltered workshops, private programs, or sadly, many stayed at home. But things were about to change. The lessons from the past have much to teach us. So let's go back to the 1970s to see what we can learn. Anthony, a student, teaches us a valuable lesson. It was 1978 when Anthony started grade 9, and his arrival would soon challenge us and all his teachers to re-examine their preconceived ideas about hidden abilities, learning potential, and educational standards. He was failing his courses, rarely made eye contact, and was physically and socially awkward. He loved to read, but struggled to get his ideas down on paper. It was discovered he had a previously undiagnosed learning disability and above average intelligence. This was a relative, and learning disabilities was a relatively new concept in those years, and teachers were skeptical about this new invisible handicap. But looking back, I realized that Anthony had many autistic traits, and that little professor air about him, an expression Hans Asperger had used to describe children he was working with. But keep in mind, in those years, we had little awareness of autism and would not even hear about Asperger's until 1994. But regardless of the label, a strength-based approach would serve Anthony's needs quite well. One day, Anthony's teacher came to see me. She was upset and accused Anthony of cheating and promptly handed me his last assignment. She couldn't believe he was capable of doing such high-quality work. Anthony had been dictating his answers into a tape recorder, and then he typed them out instead of writing them in his messy hand. So I sat his teacher down and I said, I want you to listen to something. And I played her the tape. And she was impressed. She couldn't believe her ears. Could this be the same student? What magic had I performed? But there was no magic. I had just given Anthony an opportunity to demonstrate his abilities and let his strengths shine through. A $2 cassette tape, an old typewriter, along with the change in mindset, helped redirect Anthony's future toward university. From that day forward, Anthony was able to further not only his own education, but the education of his teachers as well. An amazing educational transformation began to take place, and it was because students like Anthony responded so well to a strength-based approach to teaching and a new appreciation for the neurological nature of learning and mislearning. Many educators started to wonder if this approach might benefit all students, and it eventually led to the development of the differentiated instruction model now used in regular classrooms worldwide. And I believe that this same approach opens up even more possibilities for students on the spectrum who also learn differently. Now, I just want to take a moment here and just show you, I had mentioned the legislation that was passed. So here's some information of the dates when we became aware of autism, and you can see how the prevalence rates increased. So I thought you might be interested in just having a look at that. So now let's fast forward to the 1990s. As more and more children with autism were being identified, and they caught the schools completely off guard. So educators, feeling at a loss, turned to the medical treatment programs or healthcare agencies for advice and direction, rather than looking toward the well-established school programs from leaders in autism education. And while the medical treatment programs and healthcare agencies offered valuable advice and were extremely helpful, it seemed to misdirect their attention away from the educational needs, and schools were more focused on behaviors, which is understandable. And as an ever-increasing number of students with autism began attending high school, I noticed the response from teachers and educators was similar to the resistance, skepticism, and misunderstandings I had experienced back in the 1970s. Had we forgotten the important lessons learned from students like Anthony? Had we fallen back on old habits when encountering something new and seeing only the label and what was wrong rather than what could be better? Had we forgotten the value of understanding the neurological nature of learning and mislearning? Even the Ministry of Education's Special Education Handbook raised the same concerns as recently as 2019. And what they describe is not only the situation that teachers in Ontario were facing, but it also reflects what is still taking place in many schools across North America and beyond. And this handbook is part of the special education teacher training. This is what one of the guidelines. There are other handbooks as well. So I'm just going to have a look at that, share my screen. So this is the special education handbook. Very often, a student identified with an autism spectrum disorder comes to the classroom with a treatment program already in place. The teacher and the ed assistant, if the classroom is fortunate enough to have one, is then expected to adhere to the tenets of that program and sometimes even be in charge of implementing it, whether or not the teacher or the ed assistant agree with its principles or have received training in it. As well, especially in inclusive classrooms, a method with laid-on requirements has the potential of denying the purpose of inclusion by isolating the student, however unintentionally. On the other hand, teachers can be just as confused and challenged by a student with autism spectrum disorder as anyone else. And the clear plan of response typically outlined in a treatment program may well be a relief. So I looked to Temple Grandin for helpful advice to see what we could do about shifting this mindset. And this is what she has to say. So let's look at autism a little differently, and maybe that'll help to redirect our focus. So she says, if you want to know what the symptoms of autism mean, you have to go beyond the behaviors of the autistic person and into his or her brain. But wait, isn't the diagnosis of autism based on behavior? Isn't our whole approach to autism a result of what the experience looks like from the outside, the acting self, rather than what the experience feels like from the inside, the thinking self? Yes, which is why I believe the time has come to rethink the autistic brain. With COVID and the effect it's had on education, we've had the opportunity to stop and reflect on what our students really need. And this pause offers us an important opportunity to rethink and reimagine how we might do things better going forward. So I think there's a hopeful path ahead of us. So once again, I turn to the students to help redirect our attention and learn from their experiences as we take a closer look at the thinking self and we place less focus on the acting self. So we're going to meet Larry, and he's going to give us a reading lesson. My experience working with students with learning disabilities deepened my understanding of the challenges they faced learning how to read, which was often referred to as dyslexia. But I had never heard of the term hyperlexia until I received the following email from a helpful parent around 2003. And this is what she had to say about her son. When he was 2-ish and not talking, his grandmother bought him a plastic placemat with the alphabet and pictures all around the edge. He liked the letters, not the pictures as much, and he learned what the letters and sounds were quite easily. I then bought him plastic letters that stuck on the side of the bathtub. He was about 3. I would sit with him at bath time and stick up 2 or 3 letter words, and he would make the sound of each letter, put them together, and say the words. So he read at 3 also. That's how he learned to talk, reading first. So he was hyperlexic, and thank God for it. An amazing feat for a child with communication challenges. He learned to read as a way to discover his words and develop the ability to speak. It was learning to read that brought his words to life as he began to unlock the elusive code of spoken language hidden within his, and found meaning within his precious plastic letters. This marvelous leap from the written to the spoken word reveals a different pathway toward language acquisition that allows us to see such abilities as strengths rather than as meaningless mechanical skills or obsessions which should be discouraged rather than worked with. Many parents told me that they had been told to take away their child's alphabet cards or letters or books, which they carried with them in much the same way other children clung to a favorite stuffed animal. But the parents knew in their gut something more was going on, something important. And so they let their child keep their books and letters. And as a teacher, I couldn't understand how a love of books and the written word could be seen as anything but a strength. hyperlexia, precocious reading, often accompanied with a fascination with letters and numbers, offers us a window into the particular learning style of a child from which to build further skills. And I soon discovered that other students in my class, like Larry and Kenny, also had taught themselves to read at an early age. So on the advice of another parent, I was directed to learn more about the work of Dr. Daryl Treffert, a leader in the field of autism and hyperlexia. And from there, I discovered world-renowned speech and language pathologist Phyllis Kupperman, with expertise in hyperlexia and education. And she's also the founder of CHAT, Communication Health, Advocacy, and Therapy. I found the resources to be extremely helpful, and I soon adopted an if in doubt, write it out approach in my classroom as we developed an enriched and vibrant literacy program, which benefited all the students. I also noticed that many of my students with hyperlexia also love to quote favorite movie scripts or TV shows, and this is a trait often referred to as echolalia, and it's still considered by many to be another meaningless behavior to be discouraged. But Dr. Barry Prezant, another leader in the autism field and an expert on echolalia, proves otherwise, as he continues to see the ongoing need to advocate for a different understanding of echolalia and see it as more of a compensatory strategy and strength for building new skills and abilities. So let's meet Mark, and we have our next lesson. And I like to refer to echolalia as thinking in scripts. One of Temple Grandin's books is called Thinking in Pictures, because that's her particular style. But thinking in scripts works very well to describe the following situation. So let's have a look. One of the best compliments I ever received was from a student who loved The Simpsons. I had an important meeting after school that day, so I arrived wearing a dress and a batik scarf. I was a little more dressed up than I usually was in my more casual look, but I never thought the students would even notice. But as soon as I entered the class, Mark immediately ran up to me and said in his best Bart Simpson voice, "And me without my camera." And I think I began to blush. Now, this exchange on its own may not seem that unusual. We often quote favorite movies when we're talking with friends who have similar interests. But keep in mind that Mark had a great deal of difficulty carrying on the more traditional conversational exchanges of daily life that happen naturally and spontaneously for most of us, and we sort of take it for granted. But Mark tended to rely on his chair's scripts to express himself and often had difficulty finding his own voice. Many of my students relied on scripts and borrowed dialogue to keep pace with the rhythm of language and to fill in the silences that might otherwise end a conversation. Their style of conversation may seem unconventional, but the desire to connect and communicate is strong and sincere. And me without my camera captured Mark's feelings perfectly. Wouldn't you agree? Our literacy program celebrated these unique skills as we brought words to life in the classroom through stop motion videos using claymation. You can check out the how-tos on how to do it on YouTube. It's a lot of fun. Or Lego. There's a Lego book by Klutz Publications. It shows you how to do stop motion using Lego. And the students started to write their own social stories using photos of themselves. They performed in plays, and they also discovered the world of graphic novels. Our classroom library was soon overflowing with books we created ourselves, and the students would read them over and over again with pride and admiration. An obsession? I think not, but simply a love for words and a chance to make meaningful connections with friends sharing similar interests. Now we're going to meet Tally, who's going to challenge us even more. This is the knitting lesson. When Tally started high school, her tendency to pull at threads and scratch her skin became even more pronounced as she had difficulty adjusting to the new school. But things were about to change when she was encouraged to join a knitting class organized by a parent volunteer, where Tally soon discovered her talent and passion for wool. Now her obsession for pulling at threads was transformed. A challenging behavior was redirected into a strength. Pulling at threads and scratching her skin was replaced with a positive tactile sensory experience of feeling the wool between her fingers as it was transformed into colorful hats and scarves. She was encouraged to bring her knitting to class to both alleviate stress and regain a sense of calming control. Once quiet and withdrawn, Tally now couldn't stop talking about her love of knitting and soon was selling her handiwork to students and staff. Her Harry Potter scarves were a big hit. And as I had mentioned earlier, I was encouraging my students to develop their literacy skills. And Tally and other students who had not been taught to read beyond the functional literacy level were soon devouring books like Harry Potter. Many of the students became good readers and exceeded expectations once they were given a chance and an opportunity to learn. My book goes into greater detail about how to develop a vibrant literacy program and how to teach reading. And of course, I use the experience that I gained from working with my students with learning disabilities. I was grateful for that. And numbers came to life in our classroom as well. Here's our classroom vending machine. And the students who were weak in math skills or felt when they had to interact in the community to make an exchange and face someone, they were dealing with the social and the money, and our vending machine just changed all of that. And you could, with Velcro strips on the front, change the level of difficulty. So the vending machine would grow as the students grew with their own skills. And I think I have another version of it. Oh, and of course you can see they can stand behind it and they enjoy doing that. And they always said to the person, don't forget your change. That just became a popular chant in our classroom. And here's another one. And I heard from another teacher, they actually added electricity and bells and whistles. So you can go very far with this. There were many opportunities for creative expression in our classrooms. So let's look at the next one. Young Voices. This was a very popular magazine in our classroom. It's published by the Toronto Public Library. It's a magazine of teen writing and artwork, and everything in the magazine is chosen by student judges. So peers judging peers and working together. It's quite wonderful. And we decided it might be a good idea to submit one of our class poems. And so Eric, who became our resident class poet, was chosen to submit his poem. Eric developed his talent and passion for poetry because he felt more comfortable there expressing and sharing his thoughts in poetry. One of his poems that was selected caused a great sensation in our classroom, and we were all so proud of him. So let's have a look at the poem. Here it is. Rose, where did you get that red? Magic spells could say, make it work. Paint it yellow, orange, green, pink, red. We need paintbrushes with long brown handles. We need brushes and paint cans. We need to open the cans, mix the paint. Swimming oceans of red. We need long brushes. We need paint to make it pink. We need 60 paintbrushes and long strokes of red on the rose. The rose is marvelous. The rose is exquisite. The rose is perfect. So that's really a wonderful poem. And you can also see not only his poetic talent, but you can see his interest in colors and art. And so that leads us to our next example of celebrating art as an important source of self-expression for the students. So here you'll see actually the cover of my book. Eric painted his version of Monet's Bed of Chrysanthemums, and his brother David, who attended the same special needs high school, painted the back cover painting, which appears there. And we loved our school garden, and we also liked the book, The Secret Garden. So they're celebrated here. All the students were inspired by the art and poetry featured in Young Voices, and they wanted to create their own magazine. The students began to explore the freedom of expression offered by the poetic form, rap poetry, the spoken word, acrostics, haiku, All of them offered the structure and the freedom not found in more prosaic exchanges. So we began to collect our poems into a laminated book, properly bound, and added it to our personal classroom library. One day, we welcomed an educator from another school who was interested in learning more about special ed high school programs. We proudly showed her a poetry book, and after leafing through the book, she turned to me and said in front of the students, "Do they even know what it means?" I found myself at a loss for words. I didn't say anything, and she left. As often happens, I thought of the perfect answer long after she left the room. So maybe it's not too late, and I'll share it with you today. What is poetry? John Stuart Mill, the English philosopher, knew just what to say. What is poetry? It has often been asked, what is poetry? The word poetry imports something quite peculiar in its nature, something which does not even require the instrument of words, but can speak through the other audible symbols called musical sounds, and even through the visible ones, which are the language of sculpture, painting, and architecture. All this we believe is and must be felt, though perhaps indistinctly, by all upon whom poetry in all of its shapes produces an impression beyond that of tickling the ear. Music, poetry, and other art forms like Lego sculpture, a knitted scarf, a cultivated garden, a vending machine, origami chess pieces, a perfectly executed freehand drawing to scale of the dashboard of a student's family car from memory, or designing humane livestock handling facilities all over the world, all represent the essence of poetry and our connection to others. So here is Dr. Daryl Treffert, who I mentioned earlier. So, as Dr. Daryl Treffert often said, it's so important to keep teaching to the talent, to the strength. And that's just what I did. So traits like hyperlexia and echolalia can now be understood as compensatory strategies or a way that the brain adapts when faced with sensory and perceptual challenges. But I still needed to learn more about the different ways we all experience the world. So I rolled up my sleeves and took a deep dive into the latest research. And what I discovered was fascinating, allowing us to see things from a different perspective. Oh, and before I go on, I just want to mention, if you want to learn more about Dr. Daryl Treffert, I encourage you to visit the TreffertCenter.com. Phyllis Kupperman, find out more at chatwithus.org. To learn more about echolalia, Dr. Barry Present, barrypresent.com, and he has a new podcast, so I encourage you to listen to it. And I also want to mention the early years, because that's not the focus of my talk. But with COVID and young children at home, I know parents are feeling at a loss. I really like this book, COVID, even before there was COVID, it's excellent. It's called An Early Start for Your Child with Autism, using everyday activities to help kids connect, communicate, and learn. So it just becomes built into your daily life. And it's very accessible, easy to do. And it's based on the Early Start Denver model by Sally Rogers, Geraldine Dawson, and Lori Bismara. And there's more about these things in my book. So let's get back to how do we see things differently? And when we understand how each of us may see things differently and experience the world differently, we can learn a lot about each other. So what is perception? It seems that what we end up seeing and hearing, that is perceiving, has more to do with the brain and mind and less to do with the eyes and ears. To understand perception and how we experience the world, we must look past the acting self and search for the answers within the thinking self, for there is much to be discovered. Perceptual illusions can often reveal much about the inner workings of the mind, and that might help us understand each other a little better. So the next slide will explain a little bit about how the brain perceives information. Perception is in the mind of the beholder. So I took this passage from the wonderful Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. And the children in the novel are listening to a radio show by a scientist, and they're learning about science. So he's going to explain perception to us, and I quite like it. The brain is locked in total darkness, of course, children, says the voice. It floats in a clear liquid made inside the skull, never in the light. And yet the world it constructs in the mind is full of light. It brims with color and movement. So how, children, does the brain, which lives without a spark of light, build for us a world full of light? So what we're going to do now is that we're going to have our first illusion to see what perception is all about and how we may not experience things the way they actually are. Okay, so what you have here is called the Ames room, distorted room illusion. And what you see is not what you get. So if you have a look, the pig on the left looks big and the pig on the right looks small. But what you see is not really what you get. You see, the pigs are exactly the same size. So we were fooled. And it doesn't even matter if I told you, we are still fooled. Let's go back and have a look. And there we go. Now, if you saw the Temple Grandin film, you may remember that she built this room. It was a challenge by her science teacher. And she recreates this illusion. So if you get a chance, I do encourage you to see the film and watch for this scene. And she used horses. So how can it be that we don't always perceive things accurately? I mean, in a way that seems like doesn't make sense. This illusion demonstrates how our eyes can be fooled, and that is an important insight when we look at speech perception in an example that we'll look at in a minute. But I also want us to think about the eyes. So let's go to the next one. Oh, here we go. All right. Seeing things differently. Let's look at eye contact to see what we can learn more about how we perceive information. Eye contact, or the lack of eye contact, is often considered to be a main feature of autism. But I needed to learn more about this common trait. In keeping with my training in special education, I asked myself, okay, so there's a problem with the eyes and looking at the eyes, but I wanted to know, what are they doing instead? I wasn't interested in what they weren't doing. I wanted to know what they were doing, because I thought that would provide the information we need. So was it avoidance or something else? So then I thought about Kenny. At the age of 16, Kenny still rarely made eye contact. He was a kind, soft-spoken student whose verbal exchanges were short and direct and often delivered in a rather monotone style. But when singing in his community choir, his tenor voice was suddenly awakened as he discovered a more meaningful way to express his feelings. Singing has allowed Kenny to find his true voice and make meaningful connections that extend well beyond our welcoming eyes to a place deep within our hearts. Even in adolescence, many of my students still demonstrate a level of disinterest with respect to eye contact, not so much avoidance. And the issue was continually being addressed, yet it remained unresolved. And while they had learned to look at us when required, I noticed it wasn't something they had warmed to. But they learned to manage and make eye contact when necessary, for social reasons, for co-op placements, or when requested. But did they feel it helped their own understanding during conversations? I think not. Nevertheless, they were good sports about it and went along with it to please us and tried to fit in. Many autobiographies by autistic people also take up this same point, and I explore that in my book as well. So we have to ask ourselves, Does eye contact improve language acquisition skills, speech perception, comprehension, and communication skills for autistic children in the same way it does for typical children? Or might it actually interfere with language acquisition at certain stages of development? Perhaps there is a delicate balance to be found when integrating individual perceptual, sensory, and neurological challenges. So once again, I turn to the research that addresses these very questions, which I will now share with you. And here we're going to experience an auditory illusion, and it's called the McGurk effect. And what you see is not always what you get. So I'll just bring that up. Here we go.
Ba, ba, ba.
Have a look at this.
Ba,
What do you hear?
ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba.
But look what happens when we change the picture.
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba. Ba.
And yet, the sound hasn't changed. In every clip, you are only ever hearing ba with a B.
Ba, ba, ba.
It's an illusion known as the McGurk effect.
Ba,
Take another look.
ba.
Concentrate first on the right of the screen.
Ba,
Now to the left of the screen.
ba.
The illusion occurs because what you are seeing clashes with what you are hearing.
In the illusion, what we see overrides what we hear. So the mouth movements we see as we look at a face can actually influence what we believe we're hearing. If we close our eyes, we actually hear the sound as it is. If we open our eyes, we actually see how the mouth movements can influence what we're hearing. Ba, ba, ba.
It's a bizarre effect. Remember, the only sound you're hearing is ba with a B.
Ba, 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 ba.
What's remarkable about this illusion is even knowing how it's done doesn't seem to make a difference.
Ba. The effect works no matter how much you know about the effect. I've been studying the McGurk effect for 25 years now, and I've been the face in the stimuli. I've seen stimuli thousands of times, but the effect still works on me. I can't help it. Ba, 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 ba.
The McGurk experiment shows us that even when our senses are working normally, we can still make mistakes in interpreting their signals.
So pretty cool. Today, many autism professionals still believe that typical speech perception is essentially an auditory process, and this view continues to influence various treatment approaches and therapies. In 1976, cognitive psychologist Harry McGurk proved otherwise by pointing to the important influence of the visual modality, that is, reading lips, during the perception of sound. This suggests the need for some individuals to look at the mouth and not the eyes as they try to integrate all the multi-sensory aspects of speech perception. We see this with people who are hard of hearing or as we age and instinctively look to the mouth for clarification when we mishear things. Still, others may turn their head away or present a preferred ear if they haven't heard things correctly. Still, and we see this actually in many children with autism. We easily accept these adaptations as understandable for the elderly or hearing impaired, but tend to pathologize autistic children and see them only through a behavioral lens if they avoid the eyes or turn their head. Our brains intuitively adapt when faced with sensory challenges. So what might it mean for children with autism? What can we learn from this? So I wanted to look at more research. And I should mention too that there was important research done testing children and adults with autism, and they were presented with the McGurk effect. And the findings were very interesting. And I've read those studies. I'll show you a slide in a minute. And they're also referred to in my book. And we see different responses to the McGurk effect. Not everyone is fooled. And what we look at is, what is the learning profile? What are the strengths? Why do they respond differently? And what does that tell us? What are the implications for learning programs and therapies? So it's fascinating research. Just gonna have a sip. So I needed to learn more about what was going on with the eyes. And I turned to Ami Klin, an autism researcher, well-known. He's at Emory University. And he asked the same questions. He wanted to track the eye movements and see what was going on. And what he discovered was interesting. He noticed that while less attention was being paid to the eyes, which is what he expected when he did his experiment, he noticed something fascinating. He noticed that actually there was more focused attention on the mouth. And this is what he had to say. So I will find that for you. Here we go. He showed in his experiment, he showed people with autism and typical people a little clip from Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. And if you remember that film, it was with Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, and they were having quite a heated conversation, quite animated. So the researchers noticed that the more participants focused on mouths, the more socially competent they were, because they did a whole history. And they found that this runs counter to what many professionals were assuming. That is, the more eye contact leads to improved social competence. But they were finding something else. Klin and his colleagues said, this result raised the possibility that by focusing on mouths, these individuals with autism might attain some understanding of social situations, perhaps because of greater focused attention on speech. Whereas attention to eyes may not lead to any additional social insights. So it really raises a lot of important questions. And McGurk and Klin reveal that the dynamic relationship that exists when we try to integrate sight and sound raises questions about speech perception. And even though with McGurk, he's looking at isolated sounds on their own, it's a decoding exercise. It's not language, it's not a conversation, but still those insights, we can see the effect and the on what happens during speech perception, particularly when somebody has difficulty integrating all the senses. So that's important when we look at the other research. So let's look at that slide. So they found that not everyone is affected by the McGurk effect, and these are some of the studies, and you can find this in my book. And what was interesting, they said skilled musicians were not subject to the McGurk effect in this particular study. And the other studies that they did looked at the response to children and adults with autism. So they're worth looking at if you ever get a chance to do that. So the studies found that children with adults with autism had varied responses to the effect. And they go into great detail in investigating these responses. Now, Klin and his colleagues have also been studying the decline in attention to eyes in infants in their more recent studies and in children later diagnosed with autism. So they saw it was present in babies, and then they monitored the decline in children who later proved to have autism. So this was an interesting finding. It was present and then declined. And another study falsifies the gaze aversion hypothesis. So look to Ami Klin for more exciting research because there's still a lot to learn. So as I close, as we understand different minds, the wheels within different kinds of minds are turning, but they've chosen to follow the road less traveled, simply focusing on behaviors without considering an individual's adaptive strategies to process what is being communicated may end up misdirecting our attention and keep us from recognizing an important opportunity to improve communication skills, sensory integration, and above all, the opportunity for meaningful relationship. And now I'd like to give the final word to David. Here, David invites us to follow the path in his secret garden and explore its hidden treasures, for there is still much to discover.
Thank you. That was very interesting, Corinne. I read your book. A lot of it is about the classroom and the work that teachers and in cooperation with parents can do. But we're now in a very, very peculiar time where the classroom for many kids has disappeared, at least is irregular, that parents are. What suggestions, advice do you have for parents who are both wrestling with COVID-19 and have their kids at home now? I mean, this must be, and the kids themselves are denied the kind of intimate contacts that they had, even though you explain that the nature of their contacts are different. They're all, a lot of it is being denied. How do we work with kids now?
Okay, so of course the age of the student makes a difference, but essentially, you know, what I've seen happening, and I have a website and newsletters, and I keep learning about so many valuable online resources available to parents for free. And if you visit my website, my newsletter, and the articles that I have as well on my site, there's one that looks at COVID, that's what it's called. And all the free websites you can go to with educational material, visits to museums and so on. And I know a lot of parents are so resourceful and have found a lot of these things on their own anyway, but I've tried to kind of organize it for them. And my upcoming newsletter is going to feature more online resources for parents because many are feeling, you know, we're now how many months in and we need more. But I've been so impressed by, and I've attended so many webinars before, which didn't have many glitches like this one, but like I saw Stephen Shore last week. He's really big, and I've gone to Temple Grandin's webinars. They're mainly Q&A, so it gives parents an opportunity to ask specific questions, and they are really taking the time, you know, from these great leaders to give that kind of advice. So you can go there, and I have that information on my website if you want, and you can visit there and get it. So you can get questions that address your personal needs. To give a general question, I can tell you where to go, but you know, each situation is different. And a parent might have an older child and need one answer, a younger one and something else. And maybe they're trying, I heard from a parent this morning who she actually interviewed me on a podcast in the States. It's called My Autism Tribe. It's wonderful. And she was saying that in Kentucky, that parents really are struggling because there aren't a lot of supports for them. So, but it's important to go online. Instagram, I'm finding parents are sharing these ideas. So go online. I really wasn't part of this social media world, I can tell you, but I love it because I've been able to meet so many of the people I've been reading about. I've been able to connect with families and learn from them what they're doing. So if you visit my website, see what might appeal to you in your particular situation.
Corinne, do you have your website address?
I think it was somewhere at the beginning, but it's teachexceptionalminds.com. So write that down. I won't put up anything because I'm afraid to touch any more buttons. Okay. So, the partnerships that have developed between the teachers and the families, I think they're enriched because now the teachers understand what's going on at home, and the parents think, how many students are you teaching? You know, it's not just my kid. How do you do this? I'm struggling. So there's such, it's really nice to see that. And I think when we go back and when things go back to normal, that will carry on. And I think it will help us reimagine and rethink how we can do things better.
Okay, Corinne, there was another question that was raised.
Yes.
Why are so many, this is the questioner, why are so many, or do we understand so many of the autistic kids being male? Is there a disproportionate gender split? And so why?
They say that, but that's not my area. So you would have to ask the people who are specialists in this field. So I just, once they show up in my class, that's where I start. So I don't know. It's genetics, but it's interesting. Oh, I will say this though. They do feel that a lot of girls are not being diagnosed as easily. So that in fact, the split might be different. So that is something that's being investigated right now. And the research looks interesting because the girls tend to want to socialize more and learn to compensate, but then that ends up increasing levels of anxiety and creating other problems. So that I could comment on that. And again, read up on it because there's just new research coming out.
It's interesting. I had never thought of that before. Corinne, let me read this question to you. You advise teachers and parents that struggle to teach children reading and speaking skills to look to the child's interests and strengths. But how do you approach and coach this with the very young and with teenagers?
Okay, well, with teenagers, I'll start there. I mean, they love the graphic novels because my background is in teaching English, so I'll quote Hamlet for a good answer. Suit the action to the word and the word to the action. And graphic novels bring words to life. And when you can bring words to life, the reading skills will follow. And then technically, I mean, I'm trained in teaching reading for the children who struggle with it, or for students that were in my class and were not, they're only read at the functional literacy level. So then I introduced a very detailed reading program. And luckily I got to work with the students over a number of years as well. But once the love of books is there, there's much you can do. And that holds true for very young children as well. The best thing that you can do for any child, and really, when we look at good teaching methods, I always say special education is just teaching at its best. And so the best thing you can do is read to your child, read books, sit together and read. And there's a lot to be gained from that. And there are books written about how important the pre-reading activities and skills are before you worry. And then it will come. I mean, or seek out more professional advice if you have other concerns. But a love of books.
Has there work been done how to understand and help this functional repetitive speech pattern that often presents?
Yes, and I know that Barry Present in his book, Uniquely Human, I'll direct you there. And that's what I have in my book. It really is a resource. So I summarize many of the good research that's been going on. And I would say, look at Barry Present and go to his website. And as I say, he has a new podcast too. And I think he can address some of those issues and maybe other questions that relate to it, because there are many moving parts when we're looking at, we can't look at something so much in isolation, but you want to get the bigger picture. So Uniquely Human, it was a huge bestseller, and he's an expert in echolalia, and he's has a background in psycholinguistics.
Okay. Before we end, and I'm going to take the opportunity to ask or to make the last comment. I think, Corinne, really found what you've had to say very, very interesting. I think you've opened the door to an awful lot of contact with an awful lot of parents who are going to take a look at your website, and I trust that you welcome those contacts. I think you have become the resource. Anyway, and I think there's somebody who will be thanking you. This has really been quite remarkable.
Okay, thank you, Hesh.
Hi, so I'm the somebody who has the honor of thanking you. So Corinne, first of all, I have to say, isn't technology wonderful? And thank you for your patience, and thank our participants for hanging in there. Corinne's voice is very enticing and her work is exciting. So just listening to you was wonderful all by itself. Although the screens, certainly sharing the videos was also fascinating. I hope that everyone found the program today as informative and interesting as I did. I know that having a tiny little bit of experience with little ones who are sometimes in the throes of being diagnosed with autism, you've answered a lot of interesting, or at least got me thinking about a lot of interesting points. I've always wondered what happens when these little guys grow up and how they're recognized. And some of the points you raised are just so fascinating. The one about girls, because we tend to see them when they're 2.5 and 3, little girls often present with what's called unknown behavioral problems or something like that. And often by the time they are, somewhat into the program, somebody says we need an assessment, and they in fact are on the autism spectrum. So I think that's a really interesting point. I loved your story about the knitting and the poetry, and how you take the strengths and turn those into, really valuable life skills, and show the exception of all of these people. I always recognize that when we talk about people on the autism spectrum, really, it's not so different from most of us. There are so many lessons to be learned for our so-called typical children, and for all of us, to listen to what people really have as talent, and to really find what people have, not just expect that everybody will be the same, because we're simply not. Anyway, I want to thank Hesh Troper, today's moderator, and certainly thank Corinne Levitt, our featured speaker. I want to thank the Families with Young Children Committee and its chair, Joe Traeger and Stan Lakin, and let everybody know that there will be an edited recording of today's presentation, leaving out some of the glitches, that will be posted to the Adath website in a couple of days. Thank you all so much for attending today's presentation, and I really wish you a wonderful day.
Okay.